Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and a very, very warm welcome to today's webinar on Raising the Curtain on deep seabed mining. And I hope you really enjoy the video, really shedding a light on the deep sea coral diversity of the Emperor Seamounts in the central North Pacific. It's actually an area which is targeted for seabed mining. Today, we have a very exciting panel lineup, and we're looking forward to a discussion with you. And we will actually look at exploring some of the legal, institutional, and financial, and also the wider societal issues around deep seabed mining. So again, a very warm welcome. We're very happy for you to be here today. This webinar is co-organized by IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature, and DOSI, so the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative. And the video was actually provided by Schmidt Ocean Institute. So thank you very much for actually helping to kind of set the scene a little bit. So what we thought we'd do before we actually launch into having a discussion about this, and before I introduce the panelists, we'd like to start with checking in with you and see who do we have in the audience and what is your perception currently coming into this webinar. So if we could launch the poll, please, you should be able to see that on your screen, and you can select one of the following. So the question is whether, so should deep seabed mining be, first option is banned based on the clear harm, a moratorium until further detailed research is completed, or allowed based on best current knowledge and practice, or the final option is I don't know, because I don't have enough information to decide. So we'll give you just a few seconds to click one of those options. And once you've actually done that, we will actually continue, and we will actually revisit this a little bit later. So while this is up and running in the background, to start off with kind of contextualizing and setting a scene, we thought we'd show you a very short 2-minute video from IUCN. So what IUCN has to say on deep seabed mining. So if we can show that video, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Deep seabed mining is the search for and exploitation of minerals found on the ocean floor, like copper, manganese, or cobalt, on seamounts, abyssal plain, or hydrothermal vents. These are new environments, but for minerals that are often commonly found on land.
Right now, we're heading into a gold rush. A number of countries and companies are looking for ways of quickly coming in and grabbing some of these resources. This is being done with lax environmental standards, and as IUCN, we're really concerned with how is this going to play out.
Unlike many activities that take place on the high seas above, the unique aspect of seabed mining in the international area is that the Law of the Sea Convention has deemed the seabed and its mineral resources to be the common heritage of mankind, and demands that seabed mining be managed in a way that benefits us all.
What we need to do now is take some more time to come up with a regulatory framework which is really rigorous. We need to do proper environmental impact assessments, the way we do for all other mining activities around the planet. This is an issue that will affect coming generations. In an afternoon, we can destroy ecosystems that's taken tens of thousands of years to develop.
We still lack the technologies, the knowledge, and the wisdom, really, to ensure that we can manage seabed mineral extraction in a way that does not cause serious, extensive, and long-lasting harm. We do need to apply a precautionary approach and really consider whether this is the best path to proceed at this moment in time.
Excellent. So we're now about to start our discussion. So we're going to have an expert panel which will explore the multiple dimension of the International Seabed Authority, ISA, intergovernmental organization charged with administrating the area. And the area being the seafloor beyond national boundaries and its mineral resources on behalf of mankind as a whole, which you heard in the video. The legal framework established under United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, established actually a revolutionary regime, designated the area and its mineral resources as common heritage of mankind. Consequently, UNCLOS designates the ISA as the competent organization through which its 167 member states shall organize and control mining activities in the area collectively. So I'd now like to introduce you to our expert panel that we have here with us today. Firstly, I'd like to start with introducing Christina Gjerde. No stranger to us. She is the IUCN, she's also part of IUCN's World Commission on Protected Areas, the specialist High Seas Specialist Group. She's also the High Seas Advisor to the IUCN Global Marine and Polar Program. Very active in the BBNJ negotiations, part of also leading IUCN's delegation. And also in terms of deep seabed mining, the regulation at the International Seabed Authority. A very, very warm welcome to you, Christina. Very nice to have you here with us today. Next panelist I'd like to introduce is Jessica Battle from WWF. She's the senior expert on global ocean policy and governance. Jessica has over 20 years of policy experience and advocacy, and she's currently the lead for the No Deep Seabed Mining Initiative at WWF. A very warm welcome to you, Jessica. Very nice to see you here with us today. I'd like to move on to the third panelist, which is Torsten Thiele. Torsten Thiele is a Harvard Advanced Leadership Fellow. He has worked with major financial institutions such as JP Morgan and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And he's also the founder of the Global Ocean Trust, focusing on marine conservation, technology, and governance. Very happy to have you with us here today as well, Torsten. Very warm welcome. And last but not least, we have Pradeep Singh. He's joining us. He is the IASS Research Associate for Deep Seabed Mining. And he's also the co-author, together with Torsten Thiele, an upcoming paper to test mining and fair benefit sharing. Very, very warm welcome to you as well, Pradeep. So I think that is all of the panelists here, and without any kind of further delay, I think we should start this exciting discussion today. So, as I mentioned before, as a bit of prelude, is that under UNCLOS framework, the ISA has the mandate to ensure that mining activities are to benefit humankind as a whole, in particular the interests of developing countries, adopt measures necessary to secure the effective protection of marine environment, to promote and support marine scientific research, and to enhance capacities of developing countries. So this panel will actually shed a light on the current legal, institutional, financial, but also the wider societal issues surrounding that, and what it takes also to truly meet this manifold of different responsibilities that it has. So just to kick off, I'd like to turn to you, Pradeep, who's mentioned that the ISA has 167 member states. So how are the decisions taken, and what are the institutional arrangements or issues that you see with this approach, and how could it be addressed? Pradeep, over to you.
Thanks, Mina, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Well, you're right. All signatories to the convention, to UNCLOS, they are automatically member states of the ISA. So this actually means that the assembly of the ISA is made out of 167 member states and the European Union. So the assembly is this body that is, responsible for adopting the general policies of the ISA. It's also, responsible for approving rules, regulations, and procedures of the ISA, including for exploration and future exploitation activities, the financial terms, and other, the appropriate equitable benefit sharing mechanism, for example. However, these decisions are subject to recommendation made by another body, which is known as the Council. The Assembly also, in fact, does not have a say on whether or not to approve or to reject a particular application for a mining exploration or exploitation contract. That decision also lies with this other body, the Council. Now, the Council comprises only of 36 states. These states are, of course, chosen by the Assembly, but these states are based on several interest groups, such as states that are, for example, major importers of the commodities that would come from seabed mining, or countries that are heavily invested in deep seabed mining, as well as developing countries. To add another layer of complexity to this, decisions taken by the Council are typically based on recommendation made by a technical advisory body, which is known as the Legal and Technical Commission, or LTC. Now, this body comprises of 30 members elected by the Council, and its current composition mostly includes lawyers and geologists. In fact, only a handful of these members have environmental or ecological expertise. Now, among others, the LTC makes recommendations to the Council whether or not to approve an application for a mining contract. And more importantly here, it's actually very hard for the Council to disagree with the recommendation made by the LTC on this matter. And to add to that, the Council also has only to rely on a brief report prepared by the LTC. It does not, in fact, have access to documents that the LTC relied on when it was arriving at its decision, since these are not public documents. So in short, even though all 167 member states are represented at the ISA through the Assembly, critical decisions are only taken by a handful of states and actors. And just to compound things further, even though the Assembly is supposed to be the supreme organ that exercises oversight over all of the organs, its actual annual meetings in Kingston are poorly attended, and its function has been mostly ceremonial of late. So moving forward, I guess what needs to be done in the near future is that the ISA should consider setting up a dedicated environment committee to provide environmental expertise, or at least significantly enhance the environmental capacity of the LTC. Moreover, the LTC would also be required to provide a lot more information and evidence in its brief reports to the Council, so that the Council can make a more informed decision. In line with the precautionary principle, the ISA should also, as a rule of thumb, apply a rule that applications for exploitation contracts will not be approved until and unless the proponent can first demonstrate its ability to manage environmental impacts. And lastly, I guess there's also this critical need to sort of augment the involvement, participation, and outreach of the Assembly, which I've mentioned is, not really properly functioning at this moment. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Pradeep, for kind of setting that out. There was some issues with the sound, so just if I can repeat, if I heard it correctly. So your suggestion for or approach would be to set up, I couldn't really hear you there, a wider environmental committee, as well as having increased information and documentation available?
Yes.
Okay, there's one. So I hope that was all clear to everyone. I'd like to turn to Christina, and listening to if you're listening now to what Pradeep had to say and explaining the kind of setup and the status of different mandates, in your opinion, in what ways is the legal regime different from the regime for the high seas?
Well, the regime that was set up in the 1970s for seabed mining under the Law of the Sea Convention was first and foremost based on this principle of the common heritage of mankind. At that time, they were getting reports of these vast resources, manganese nodules on the seabed, and the Law of the Sea Convention at the time actually said that the seabed sovereignty was defined based on the reach of your technology. So the Law of the Sea Convention, even the resolution that was adopted in 1970, said no, the seabed area and its resources belong to humankind as a whole, and that humankind as a whole would be part and parcel of its management. As opposed to the notion of the freedom of the high seas, it's a principle of solidarity, that humankind would actually work together as equal partners in conducting marine scientific research, in exploring and exploiting the seabed resources, in building capacities and sharing technologies, and in applying the proceeds to lift developing countries out of poverty. This is really a aid program, but also a partnership. In many ways what we're looking at there. And it's also important to remember that Law of the Sea Convention set forth a very clear environmental requirement that seabed mining would ensure effective protection of the seabed area, as well as the marine environment as a whole. It talks about not damaging the flora and fauna of the marine environment, which means it covers from the seafloor to the water top and to the shores of coastal nations. I would just like to point out that the sad irony as a historian is that the push for the new rules and regulations for the seabed minerals in the 1970s was based on a covert US CIA operation where they were actually building this vessel saying we're going to go out and start exploiting the seabed minerals, but in fact they were trying to retrieve a sunken Soviet submarine. And so the prospect that mineral retrieval mining was imminent, that it could be done with minimal impact on the marine environment, was based on this show that was supposed to disguise that they were actually trying to retrieve a huge Soviet submarine to get the military secrets, called the Project Azorian. So in many ways, it's a real tragedy that we focus so much on the seafloor as a way to enrich everybody based on a fundamental misperception. Thanks.
Thank you, Christina. So, I mean, if you were to adopt the precautionary approach, I mean, what do you see in the context of deep seabed mining? What would be the avenues that would be open for implementing a precautionary approach?
Well, I was part of the EU-funded MIDAS project, where we actually started looking into sort of science policy interfaces and what the implications of environmental principles are. And what my colleagues were really looking at is, the opposite of precautionary principle is to go full steam ahead, authorize 30-year renewable contracts with adjustments to any mining technicalities at the International Seabed Authorities and hence humankind's expense. That is sort of where we're headed now. There's three other options that could be brought into play that give better effect to precaution, which is, of course, the no-go option, which is the ban on deep seabed mining. The ISA's mandate could instead be focused on supporting marine scientific research, capacity and technology, development and transfer, look for other ways to value and make use of the area and its resources in an environmentally sustainable manner. The second option is really about knowing before you go, conducting global collaborative research to truly understand the intricacies of the deep sea and the potential for impacts and what kind and how would these affect, as Torsten will talk about, the natural capital of the planet. It would be accompanied by long-term observation, monitoring, technology development, and any decision would be based on evidence of no lasting harm. And then the third option is really a slow steam ahead. Some talk about adaptive management, but it needs to be more than that. You need to actually have a hypothesis of what is going to happen, which can only be achieved through some limited forms of test mining, with the option of expanding only based on the results that would show that you could, in fact, ensure effective protection of the marine environment. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So in that light, I like to think about, if we return to Torsten, I mean, what we hear, Christina has outlined a very different options, but if deep seabed mining is going to go ahead, what would be some of the ways to ensure that the system, there is a kind of robust system that the new operators have sufficient capital and skills considered to mitigate all potential impact and as well are able to pay for all their dues? You have to unmute yourself, Torsten. Sorry.
Is this now loud and clear? Thanks, Mina, for the question.
Loud and clear, thank you.
It's really important that it is both robust and a system. What system means is that writing good regulations is important, but is certainly not enough. System includes a full understanding of the supply chain and the commercial skills that would need to be involved. It includes a financial system. It includes an impact management system, referring to what Christina just said, the impacts on the blue natural capital, and finally, a benefit sharing system that is adequate. So robust means that each of these systems don't just need to function, they need to be sustainable. So if you take each of these components, if you take the supply chain system, for instance, has an assessment been made that all aspects of the potential deep sea activity supply chain are in fact sustainable in a climate sense, that they are sustainable in a biodiversity sense, that these impacts are measured and mitigated, and that we have in this chain all the relevant capacities to do that? Is the financial system set up to actually incentivize and deliver this type of immature, robust, functioning approach? Or does it allocate costs in a way that these broader goals are not sufficiently covered? Who carries the risks? If the projects work out, who gets the upside? If the projects don't work out, who gets the downside? Those are these broader questions one would have to raise when addressing the question as to whether from an economic perspective this approach is robust. And if you then look at where we are at in this very early stage, is we have 30 roughly applications who are undertaking exploration. Now, a lot of people say this is the industry, using that word rather loosely, because most of these applicants are actually research institutes and startup entities. This is not an industry of long years of experience in undertaking mining. This is an industry exploring. And this new exploration and this participation from a research institute space means that to move from that world to what is a robust system world involves many, many different steps. And so as we design the structured approach, we need to look at all of these components. And that is why the point that Pradeep made earlier, that a lot of the expertise at the moment is on the legal and diplomatic side. We have to think further ahead. We need expertise on the environmental, on the financial, on the economic side to actually fully assess this type of approach. And to give just one little example, in other areas where mankind hands out licenses, we also have that question: how do you regulate the activity after you've handed the license? How do you ensure that the financial flows is adequate for the ultimate owner, whether that's the nation state or in this case, humankind as a whole? So in the telecommunications space in the US today, the value for these 5G auctions is $81 billion. Now those 81 billion are actually paid up in front. So that money arrives, and then that industry evolves and gets regulated. The question is, when you approach deep seabed mining, are we thinking about it in those similar ways, where the value accretes to mankind upfront before any activity takes place? Or are we entering into a process that is neither robust nor as systematic as this needs to be? Thank you.
Some excellent food for thought there. I just have to prompt in one question as well, because last week I read that one potential operator is already valued at billions, even at this early stage. So how would that payment mechanism be set up to ensure that the International Seabed Authority, as the custodian of the deep seabed of humankind, receives the fair share? So you raised a few questions, which are very valid points. So I'm actually posing it back to you and saying, what would it look like? I mean, how can you ensure that the share of future value is shared in an equitable way?
And I think you point to two really interesting data points. So if a company that does not have at this stage any kind of exploitation license already can raise a significant amount of money on the theory that it will possibly in future undertake some activities, then clearly somebody must be thinking that there is value that this company can get out of the system. Now, the question, the second part of your question is, well, where is the clarity that humankind will get benefits out of the system? And so where we're at in the process, again, we have at an early stage of a discussion of a payment system that so far purely tries to address the question how an initial mining operator could actually get to profitability and therefore to undertake an activity. The question we do need to raise is, how can humankind that is going to give up all these ecosystem service values of the deep ocean because of the activity taken on, or this future value that may be relevant for future generations that could come from a future technological use of this space, how that compensation happens. And at the moment, the only data points we have is some suggestions to give a small percentage of a royalty based on a notional revenue that will happen only in, say, 10 years' time when some mining is actually being delivered. So it's a long way from where the discussions are to addressing the point you just raised, which is, how can we be sure that there is a meaningful compensation to humankind?
Thank you very much. So, I mean, also listening to you, and I'm thinking, well, Jessica, you've been sitting there very, very quietly, listening to your other panelists. Do you have any reflection on what Torsten has said? I mean, I think he raised some very good points, but I'm thinking more in your view, what could be done to make sure that future investment are not adding to the multiple pressures that the ocean is already under? Could there be anything, what could be done in that respect?
Yeah, thank you, Mina, and thank you also for having me in this very distinguished panel. I'm very honored. I've really been listening with interest. It's always so informative to listen to all three of you. And I guess for me and for WWF, I find it, to pick up on Pradeep's point around governance, I find it really worrisome that the governance structures that would be needed in order to make these decisions at the ISA are not there yet. We do not have a committee or a group at the ISA that looks specifically at environmental issues, for example. I think the other really worrisome aspect here is that we're really kind of thinking about this very much in the dark. There's so many unknowns yet. So the unknowns range from the science, you know, the natural sciences, the impacts that seabed mining might have on areas and industries very far from the actual mining sites. You might get effects on fisheries. What downstream effects will that have now in the shorter term, let's say the 10 years that Torsten talked about, or in the longer future, in particular because there's so many other pressures already on fisheries and on the ocean ecosystem. And what are the benefits? Is this something that is going to benefit a few companies, a few CEOs, some shareholders? These shareholders will be mostly, let's face it, in the what we call the north, not in the south. How are we going to make sure that any benefits to what we call humankind now and also into the future are going to be distributed from this? It seems to me that the system that is set up is not yet guaranteeing much of that certainty at all. So, and also I wanted to also just touch upon something that I think is really important. Then I get into something a little bit more solutions oriented, but there's a risk to the ocean here, but there's also a risk to the future of our resource use as a global society. There's a risk to the circular economy that we as humanity really need to implement very, very urgently in order to take the footprint that we have as a global society on the planet as a whole. And so I think we really need to think very hard, will minerals from the seabed actually be eroding or delaying that possibility of going circular because of more mineral coming into circulation? I know there are other arguments in that space, but I would like to put that forward, and I think we have to think really, really hard about this. Governments have agreed on the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think it's really important to think about that these goals are not standalone goals. There's a goal on ocean, there's a goal on sustainable production and consumption, but they actually sit together. The goal on climate sits together with them. It's a whole, and we need to solve the whole problem. And perhaps I would think, you know, talking about decision making at the International Seabed Authority is an incredible burden on these states to make these decisions on behalf of humanity into the future. So I think we need to think about the broader issues around seabed mining and not focus only on the actual mining and the activities, the potential the potential huge damage on the local, let's say, ecosystem, but also more globally, including the economics. We have put together a set of sustainable blue economy financing principles that are being adopted across the world by big financing institutions, including the Asian Development Bank and the European Investment Bank and so forth. And here there is some guidance as to how investments could be made in industries and in activities that would be based on renewable natural resources and more equitable benefit sharing more broadly than just the minerals we're talking about. And I think that I would really encourage investors, both in government, intergovernmental investors and private investors, to look into these and think really hard about where investments should be made if you are going to be regarded as a responsible ESG investor, both now and into the future. I think I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to put that link into the chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. So just a very quick follow-up. So could deep seabed mining be compatible with under the framework of blue economy?
So in the framework that is lying as the basis of the sustainable blue economy principles, extractive industries are excluded because they are not renewable resources. So the short answer is really no.
Thank you for that. Just also some other quick, this is really rich discussion, and I also something that also resonates with me, which you're looking at the mandate in terms of marine research, etc. Christina's mentioned a few times. You mentioned it as well. It's not just the ocean floor, maybe it's the mesopelagic, or some of these also interactions and interdependence. But one thing it also stands out that is the social science, right, behind this as well. So we shouldn't forget that as well as a very important component. So I'm looking here at some of the questions coming in the poll. There is one actually on actually referring to IUCN motion, a call for a moratorium on deep seabed mining for 10 years. So who's calling for this moratorium? So just to explain that the IUCN Conservation Congress is the place where they come together to vote on the motions that have been submitted by its members. Once adopted, they become resolution and therefore the main body or policy body of IUCN's policy, so to say. And there's currently a motion, and I believe WWF, together with others, is co-sponsoring this. Would you be able to just answer that question in terms of, why are you calling for this? Well, you have obviously alluded to that, but what does it mean? And if you can elaborate a little bit on that, thank you.
Yeah, so thank you. So there are many calls for moratoria that are being expressed the last few years, and this really came into these calls for moratorium were sort of distilled into this motion for the IUCN Conservation Congress led by Fauna and Flora International, and then many NGOs working in the marine area. I believe also a few others who work more in the broader extractive industry areas are part of this resolution as co-sponsors, as well as scientist groups. And so it is really to look at precaution and also looking into other, the development of other initiatives during this time. So it's looking into how can we find other alternatives to the minerals in the deep sea. They may not be even the same minerals on land. We've just been hearing this last few weeks about substitutions for some of these minerals in the next generation batteries. We can't hold ourselves to the business as usual scenarios that are being put forward as the reason for why we need these minerals from the deep sea. So it's a realm of various issues, but it's really calling for precaution until we know enough. And one of the main arguments there, apart from the minerals demand, is really we know so little about the deep sea and about the interconnections between the deep sea and other areas, and we really need to press pause until we have enough information in order to make an informed decision. I think most of the organizations, if not all, that are sponsors of this resolution are very much making their input and their arguments and their reasoning and our positions based on science. If we don't have enough science, we can't make an informed decision. We have to wait until we have enough science. But then just one other aspect perhaps about the moratoria that are out there, because there are many. So we have calls for moratoria in national waters, even established law on moratorium in national waters in some Pacific states, including in Fiji, where that believe that the law has been enacted, is now active for 10 years. Matching the UN decade for sustainable science for ocean science for sustainable development. Sorry, but then there are other calls for moratoria also, which really are looking into, which don't have a time limit, but are rather looking into the various criteria that we feel need to be fulfilled, and they include things like governance at the ISA, a reform of the decision-making processes, transparency, etc. They include more science. They include making sure that we have exhausted all other possibilities, which includes an innovation. I mean, I think we have to remember we are a very innovative species. We find solutions if there is scarcity, and so instead of opening up the new frontier, perhaps go to innovation instead.
Thank you very much for those concrete examples of what is already out there. But if we remain in the international waters per se and to international law, Pradeep, what would you say? I mean, would a moratorium, would that be considered anti-international law?
In my opinion, no. I don't think a moratorium would be considered as anti-international law, but there are some who believe this. I think that the basis for that is sort of a misapprehension that a moratorium is more or less a permanent ban, but quite the contrary to that. A moratorium simply means a suspension of activities either for a definite or indefinite amount of time, or until or unless something happens. In fact, given the precautionary approach and the high-risk nature of deep seabed mining, one could even say that not delaying the commencement of exploitation, whether through a moratorium or some other form of understanding, that could instead be considered as contrary to international law itself. We do have, examples of moratoria in other regimes, such as one for several decades now on commercial whaling that has been adopted under the International Whaling Commission, and no one seriously argues that that is contrary to international law. I don't think it's appropriate to argue that since UNCLOS is drafted in a way that sort of allows for mining to happen, that mining should happen at all costs. I think there are plenty of other provisions under UNCLOS, such as Part 12 of the Convention on the Protection and Preservation of the Marine Environment, that would offer some pushback to this narrative. I think Christina also took us through that earlier on.
Thank you very much. I think I will have to stop you there, Pradeep, because we have a long set of question here. So for the panel, so I'm going to read out the first question to you, and this one is for Torsten. It's from Alba Escobar. Have experts evaluated the deep sea ecosystem services, diversity, processes as to assess the trade-off for losses, or have a payment mechanism that can be delivered upfront before even mining operation starts in case of any loss? Restoration actions are out of the question, are they? So you kind of answered this earlier, but if there's something that you want to add specifically to this point, and if you could keep your answers a bit short, because we have several more questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I think it's a very good question, because we are just at that entry point to a journey. We have got the Dasgupta review in the UK, which highlights how ecosystem services assessment is a core part of what needs to be done in economics. And therefore, it does outline a number of opportunities to do this in the ocean and the deep ocean space. We have a UN agreement on ocean accounting and biodiversity accounting. So that is now approved. So we have the tools. We now need to apply that kind of set of economic tools to the deep ocean to do all this evaluation and assessment before we can make then any decisions as to how this would work on a payment point of view.
Thank you very much. I have a question for you, Christina. It's from Elham Shabahat, who is asking, some argue that scientific research of deep seabed is primarily funded by the companies interested in mining or those who hold exploration contract. Is this a correct assessment of the state of scientific research? So if you can give a brief answer to that one.
Okay, I'd say it's mixed. That the contractors, which as we heard are largely research institutions up until at least 2011, were primarily doing research. This would be government institutions. But since 2011, there have been a few more ambitious private companies that have been doing research. The problem is the research is only on the areas of exploration and not the region as a whole. So in the Clarion-Clipperton zone in the Pacific, is you have these small pockets that have been researched sort of minutely to look at what minerals are there, but not the type of research we need. There is government funding from the European Union, various European states and others, but it's scattered, it's not systematic, and it's only started to shed light on what it is that we have out there.
Thank you very much. So we're getting a bit closer. Here's another excellent question. It's from Guido Corno. It is, in land mining operation, the mining company is responsible for some sort of rehabilitation and restoration activities further to the mine closure. What could these rehabilitation activities consist of when available environmental data are minimal, as well as the overall long time for these ecosystems to develop? Is this topic being considered at all through the ISA? I don't know, perhaps, is there anyone who would like to answer that question? Obviously, we don't have ISA here on the panel, but is there anyone that feels compelled? Please put up your hand.
Well, I'll start out. I mean, we have to remember that it's the seafloor and its resources are the common heritage of humankind. So any purported system of compensation would be directly obligated to benefit all of humankind and not outside the area. But I think what we've seen in terms of rehabilitation, as we heard from Elva Escobar, it's a non-starter. So this concept of offsets that are sometimes applied in land-based mining are not really as applicable. So when you can't do that, the IUCN guidance on offsets says, well, if it's going to be immediate irreversible harm, potential loss of biodiversity, that's when you need to apply the precautionary principle.
So thank you very much. So I'm going through this as quickly as I can. There is another question, which is for Pradeep. How can scientific research, technology development, and innovation help in the drafting of better environmental regulation before engaging in deep seabed mining?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. One of the sort of work that I'm involved in right now is a sort of a proposal being mooted in the ISA on test mining, for example, where we want to make it a mandatory requirement that contractors should be able to first demonstrate their ability to manage environmental impacts and demonstrate this before they get an approval to proceed with activities. And one of the reasons for this, apart from ensuring the protection of the marine environment, is also to ensure that the ISA is able to develop or develop a reliable body of knowledge that can be used, for example, to sort of develop more stringent, robust, and effective environmental standards and regulations.
Thank you very much. We have another question with regards to the speculative sums involved. How do you avoid corruption or a plutocracy where the heads of companies or the ISA and government people are profiting, but only token compensation makes it to the rest of the world as a whole? Perhaps you would like to answer that, Torsten.
Yes, as I outlined before, the way a payment system is structured is critical in order to ensure that there is adequate compensation. assuming that we would address that in a different way from what is on the table at the moment, that still leaves a lot of other issues about the robustness of financial controls, of the accounting mechanisms. So one of the ways in land-based mining, this is addressed as often through a form of project accounting, where on the project itself, you put adequate supervision and accounts. All of these would be approaches that would be necessary in order to make sure that these systems are run correctly and safely and adequately.
Thank you very much. So two more questions that I thought I would take, which I probably will combine them. So the first part comes from Laurent Devel, who asked, do you think ISA is the right governance body due to its dual conflicting mandate as a regulator and promoter? But more importantly, any other idea to better govern and enforce the deep seabed mining activities in the future? And there's another kind of related question from Kieran Murray, basically asking, would something similar to the Antarctic Treaty be possible for regulating commercial activity in the deep sea? What would barriers to this be? And like anyone who feels compelled of answering any part of that question, please raise your hand. Any quick reflections? Any ideas in terms of the Antarctic Treaty possible for regulating deep seabed mining? Christina, very short, so we can.
Okay, well, I would just refer people to the article by Nicholas Kirkham, myself, and Meriwether Wilson, where we look at the Antarctic Convention on the Regulation of Antarctic Mineral Resources, where they actually put forward some very high thresholds for evidence of no significant adverse impacts. They have an independent scientific and technical environmental body that can actually say no, that you don't meet these criteria. And have an ongoing system to make sure that the voice of the environment is heard. I think there needs to be another element of independence, that humankind and oceankind have very little voice at the International Seabed Authority, other than a few states who are willing to speak up and speak out. Most is currently being driven by a few countries and companies that have a so-called more direct economic interest. We need to widen that accountability and processes. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So it's been a super rich discussion, but as always, when you have fun, the time flies. So we're actually soon coming up to the hour. So what I think would be really interesting now is that poll that we launched from the beginning, basically on the audience perception, I like to pull up that poll again. And if you could actually answer that question again, the same question that was there from the beginning. So whether mining should be banned based on the clear harm, or a moratorium until further detailed research is completed, or allowed based on best current knowledge and practice, or I don't know, I don't have enough information to decide. So if you could please select your option that you think aligns what you're thinking. So I think we can, if we can have those results, I'd like to disclose, like from the first poll, there were 80% of participants, attendees that voted. 26% voted for a ban, 53% on a moratorium, and 10% that it should be allowed, and 12% saying, I don't have enough information. So if we close, that was from the first poll. So if we close to second poll, we can see what the results were there. If we can have those results from the second poll to see if the kind of needle has switched or if these are similar answers. If we could have, may I have the result for the last poll? So while we're waiting for those to come up, and we'll come back to those to see if there was any change from the beginning of the webinar, I like to just kind of as we're kind of wrapping up here from the audience, yes, we have discussed in terms of whether it could be done socially, environmentally, and economically viable if deep sea bed mining can be there. And I would like to ask each one of you, you know, for people at home or, you know, people attending this webinar, what is your recommendation to the public at this point of time if people are worried about the implication of potential deep seabed mining and they wish to take some actions? What actions what can you change in your daily lives, or how can you get involved? This is a question I would pose to all panelists. Who would like to go first on some final thoughts or how the public can get engaged and what they can change in their daily lives? Jessica, you have the floor.
I read somewhere, yeah, thank you. Very interesting also to see the difference in the poll results. I think that, well, there's a couple of things that you can do. It's of course very important to ask for a change and to ask, if you can, in countries where you live, ask your government to actually send people with the requisite knowledge to the Seabed Authority for these discussions on the regulations. But more importantly, in your daily life, I think I read somewhere that there are millions of mobile phones that are lying at home in people's drawers because you got your new version, you haven't handed in your old version for recycling. That is a very simple step. Hand in what you're not using anymore for recycling, and perhaps think a little bit further about, do you actually need that next model of a mobile phone, for example? And then the other one is use more public transport rather than your own vehicle. And perhaps you could think about co-transport and other ways of transportation in your daily life other than having your own car. It's so interesting to hear that most cars are standing still and idle for an incredible percentage of their life here on the planet. And they're only used for a few percentages of their lifetime. And is there other ways of doing that? Perhaps you can, you know, take a lift with your neighbor to work tomorrow, if you can get to work in a pandemic, that is, but, you know, in a normal life at least. So there's a couple of options. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. That was some really, really concrete suggestion what you can do. Who would like to go next in terms of the setup? Pradeep, please.
Yeah, maybe just very quickly. I think along the points of what Jessica mentioned, I think it's important to hold governments accountable. It's important to hold the delegates that attend these meetings accountable, and especially at a time where treaty obligations that we have under UNCLOS, it needs to keep with time, particularly at this moment where the international community is sort of looking to pay more serious attention towards preventing the loss of biodiversity, to preserving natural capital. So I think if your governments, are saying that they are focused and interested in preventing loss of biodiversity, preserving natural capital, then they should be consistent with this also at the ISA. You can't be schizophrenic in different forums as well. So I think it's important to hold the delegates responsible for this. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Another very, very good takeaway and a message to send with our audience. Christina, would you like to go?
Sure. First, on the very practical level, for the scientists and scientifically minded people, the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, which is one of the co-sponsors of this event, of course, is a co-membership, a partnership of experts. But the experts can be in natural science, but also economics, social science, and human behavior. We do need to understand what is driving these inputs. And how do we accelerate the circular economy? So that would be a very short-term thing to do. There are other organizations like the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, the Sustainable Ocean Alliance that are also working on deep seabed mining issues for organizations, but also for individuals. And then I would sort of finally say, in terms of for the governments, is we need to start thinking about robust, systematic approaches to how we manage our own marine environment. The high-level panel on sustainable development for the blue economy is looking at 100% sustainability as just even a basic requirement for future prosperity. So we need to be thinking of better information, better joined up whole of government positions, ocean planning that also extends to cover our entire ocean, including with lots of protected areas. And that's what we need to be expecting and hoping and requesting from our governments to materialize. Thanks.
Excellent. So really, really good concrete advice and take-homes there. Torsten, what would be your take-home message or any advice to the general public?
Yeah, I'm always surprised by is that people believe that nature and value are two different things. And I think this is really where everybody can get more engaged in understanding that nature around us is what keeps us alive. That's our life. That's the system. That's where the value lies. And so understanding those parts of the system and how they interact, that's really the real challenge for the 21st century. How we understand we're part of nature, we live with nature. How can we support the living things that support us?
Very, very wise last words there, Torsten, and I couldn't have said it better myself. So I think this has been an excellent panel, very, very insightful. And we're also very happy to let you know that we will be sending out, so everybody who signed up for this, we're sending out the recording because there was so much rich content. If you want to play it back, revisit it again to digest this properly. And we also have the results from the final poll to see if there was any difference. So it was quite interesting to see that the ones that didn't have an opinion or didn't have enough information decreased from 12% down to 7%. And the moratorium basically increased from 53% to 59%. And the ones who were for a ban, a complete ban, that remained the same. But the ones that think that it should be allowed, it was reduced from 12% of the respondees to 7%. And of everyone we have online, it was a good response rate as well, about 80%. So I think we have actually used up all the hours, and I'm sure everybody has other meetings now to go to. The actual IUCN motion on a moratorium on deep seabed mining will be voted on at the IUCN Congress in September. So we obviously encourage all our members to participate in discussion and the active participation and voting. And also for anyone interested to get in touch with your national delegates. If you have any question, you can also send them to us. And I'm afraid we don't have time for anything else. So I will leave you, but I would not leave you at the bottom of the ocean, but we will actually have some kind of reminders again what it is that we are taking a precautionary approach towards. So once again, a very, very, very warm thank you to all the panelists and all your expertise and insights. And I wish everybody a nice day or evening or night. And we look forward to reconnecting with you, and we'll do that via email. Thank you very, very much. And thanks to everyone for all their support and for attending.